This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy.
Khazarian economic successes. Khazarian refugees fleeing the many invasions of their homeland formed colonies in virtually every city of the Western world. Their success in usury banking gave them an immense advantage in all avenues of business. Their barons of usury banking heaped riches upon riches. By 1730, more than a fourth of all sugar plantations in Suriname were in their hands. In the 1740s, they began to control the Brazilian diamond trade. David de Pinto was the largest stockholder in the East India Company. In 1750, Tobias Boas was allowed by the States General of Holland to share in a public loan for 500,000 gulden, and in another for 500,000. In 1793, Benjamin and Alexander Cohen participated in a 5 million gulden Prussian loan. The Universal Jewish Encyclopedia, page 432, calls them the most outstanding Ashkenazim. In the next century, the foremost family banking house was easily that of the Rothschild family. By 1848, it is said of Nathan Rothschild that while he lived, the center of the finance of the world may said to have been his office in New Court, London. But control of unbelievably large amounts of money had been the Rothschild hallmark since the first of the century. In the early 1800s, Rothschild loans to the impoverished Austrian nobility totaled 24 million gulden. The Austrian loan of 1815 was for 50 million gulden. The French loan of 1816 totaled 350 million francs. The Rothschilds had more money than most of the nations of Europe put together, and nations were the only customers large enough to be worth their time and attention. In the year 1848, the Paris house was reckoned to be worth 600 million francs, as against 352 million francs held by all the other Paris bankers. This quote indicates the importance of the Paris house of Rothschild alone, but the figures achieve true meaning when we remember that most of the remaining 352 million was also held by other Ashkenazics. For all intents and purposes, even at this early date, the entire finance of France was in the hands of the Parish Khazarian colony in exile. The borrower is servant to the lender. Interest at work. So as not to forget the damage interest does in just a few years, look again at the table on the opposite page. For each dollar borrowed, $37 must be repaid. Look at the nations that went into the net. The millions upon millions lent. Tens upon tens of millions had to be repaid for each million lent. By the 1840s, the wealth of the Khazarian bankers was enough to stagger the mind. It is easy to see how that by the 1840s, Europe was mostly mortgaged and servant to the Khazarian bankers. There was little else to be mortgaged that could enable debtors to borrow more money into existence. Consequently, it was time to foreclose mortgaged property from destitute borrowers, take possession, and sell it again to other debt-free borrowers. Foreclosure. Karl Marx, son of a rabbi, was tapped to be the spokesman. He published the Communist Manifesto in 1848 to coincide with the Revolution of 1848. The 1848 revolutions started in Sicily and almost instantly spread to Germany, France, Austria, Romania, and the Papal States, exhibiting a remarkably high degree of coordination and planning. The spark that ignited these revolutions initially sprang from old conflicts between poverty-stricken workers and debt-ridden workers, Czech, Hungarian, and Romanian Slav nationalists versus Western rulers, and political liberals versus the old monarchists. Ashkenazics were active in every group in revolt with the established order. These revolutions, which swept across Europe, were actively led and financed by thousands of Ashkenazic Jews who attempted to impose Ashkenazic solutions to Christian problems. They even furnished a few of the victims, which turned out to be a fortunate happening of which much was made later. Most of the Christian problems had been brought about in the first place by the introduction of the Ashkenazic economic usury system in the West. The byproducts were unemployment, lack of food and shelter, which made necessary unemployment insurance, old age insurance, public education, etc. With more interest-created debts than money to pay, problems and solutions flourished. When not active in the central leadership role as revolutionaries themselves, they supported and financed Western Slav nationalist groups. The revolutions unsettled all the crowns of Europe, but only King Louis Philippe of France, the client of James Rothschild of Paris, was actually dethroned and his property seized. In Italy, the Pope fled for his life. The Russians moved their army into Romania to put down the revolutions there. Gradually, order was restored. There was a frenzied attempt to dissociate European Ashkenazics from Karl Marx and communism by constant publicizing the fate of the few Ashkenazic victims. This bloody period, however, caused the entire Christian continent of Europe to become violently anti-communist. This in turn contributed to the migration. Lastly, the failed communist revolution of 1848 caused such tight control and supervision of the European Khazarian colonies that the support of the large Ashkenazic bankers switched to activities back in the Pale. The Russian Front. The new front became Russia. There was an outbreak of revolutionary activity, resulting in bombings, assassinations, and political agitation among the Jews and Slavs against the ruling Westerners. This wave of terror was met, as it had been earlier in Europe, by severe restrictions. It culminated in the Russian Solution of 1891 to 1892, with the expulsion of Jews from Moscow by order of Grand Duke Sergius, and from the interior of the country forcing Jews back into the Pale. For all intents and purposes, the Pale was an alien country in the midst of Russia, constantly patrolled by Russian armies and ruled by, air quotes, friendly appointees with the help of police. Rather than return to the Pale, most Ashkenazics living outside chose to immigrate to Russia entirely. This decision was encouraged by the Russian government. Thousands of shiploads of Khazarians set sail for America and elsewhere. The large Jewish migration took place between 1880 to 1920. They left, but they did not forget. The Ashkenazics formed colonies around their leaders in America and immediately turned their eyes back to their brothers in Russia. Modern finance. In 1905, Sergei Nilis published a book in Russia called The Protocols. The book purports to be the stolen plan of conquest made by the 300 elders who rule the world. The Ashkenazics maintain that the book is a forgery. This unwelcome publicity resulted in a virtual blackout of information on Ashkenazic financial dealings. Things are now very secretive. While tables like that of the earlier Rothschild dealings in the 1800s were commonplace earlier as they boasted of their accomplishments, now a thundering silence accompanies most of their financial coups. Certain things are common knowledge. The Ashkenazics monopolized usury banking in the Middle Ages, since usury is forbidden to Christians. As early as the 1600s, they had made servants of many of the rulers of Europe who were in their debt. By the first part of the 1800s, they had a virtual monopoly of world finance, so that entire nations who had adopted their usury system were their customers and servants. By the late 1800s, they boasted of their princely bankers and their many titles. They backed their claims with proof. The Rothschilds were one of the largest factors in the American real estate boom of the 1830s. They were also one of the largest factors in financing the U.S. national debt of the 1860s. Their operation in America have appeared low-key since they have operated through agents under other names. It is a well-known fact that Paul Warburg of Germany came to America to set up the Federal Reserve System with the aid of a few associates. It is also a matter of general knowledge that the most important district of this Federal Reserve is the wealthiest, and that is the New York district. Exactly what is going on in the Federal Reserve is a dark secret. The banking organization is lender to the United States, is its master, and arrogantly flaunts the fact that by refusing to allow itself to be audited by any sovereign state in the United States or by the federal government. Mullen's exhaustive research on the Federal Reserve sheds a great deal of light on the subject. On page 179 of his book, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, he uncovers the fact that as of July 26, 1983, the following banks owned 66% of the total outstanding shares of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the controlling district. Bankers Trust owned 6%, Bank of New York 2%, Chase Manhattan Bank 14%, Chemical Bank 8%, Citibank 15%, European American Bank 2%, J. Henry Schroeder Bank 0.5%, Manufacturers Hanover 7%, Morgan Guarantee 9%, National Bank of NA 2%. The above list seems innocuous enough. Opposite is another list which made the circuit a few years ago. This list was also given as being a list of the true owners of the Federal Reserve. 1. Rothschilds of London. 2. Lazard brothers of Paris. 3. Israel Moses Seif of Italy. 4. Warburg brothers of Hamburg, Germany. 5. Lehman brothers of New York, USA. 6. Kuhn-Loeb of New York, USA. Chase Manhattan of New York, USA. Goldman Sachs of New York, USA. This last list bears little resemblance to the first one. The chart on the next page helps to bring the two lists into harmony by listing the New York banks that own a majority of the stock in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and some of their connections. National boundaries blur as we see that the actual owners of the Federal Reserve are spread over Germany, England, and France, as well as the United States. All are parts of the whole. A conclusion may be drawn from this. In spite of the lack of discussion on the subject, it is unrealistic to assume that the Ashkenazics and their agents are presently any less a world economic force than they were in earlier years.